Hello, children, students, teachers, parents, and residents of Romulus, Michigan. This program is especially for you. My name is Jacqueline Galloway Blake, and this is Black History Month. It's Black History Month. Stop and learn. It's Black History Month. Stop and learn. It's Black History Month. Stop and learn. Stop and learn. It's Black History Month. Stop and learn. It's Black History Month. Stop and learn. It's Black History Month. Stop and learn. Stop and learn. Read a book. It's Black History Month. Stop and learn. It's Black History Month. Stop and learn. It's Black History Month. Stop and learn. Stop and learn. Listen to an eyewitness account. It's Black History Month. Stop and learn. It's Black History Month. Stop and learn. It's Black History Month. Stop and learn. Stop and learn. Watch a historical video. Now you sing with me. It's Black History Month. Stop and learn. It's Black History Month. Stop and learn. It's Black History Month. Stop and learn. Stop and learn. Read a book. Today we're going to talk about 4 aspects of Black history. You probably know a lot about Black history, but let's learn a little bit more. So the 4 points are, number 1, Black history begins in Africa, not in American slavery. Number 2, ancient Africans had advanced civilizations with universities. Number 3, the Underground Railroad came through Romulus, Michigan. And number 4, an eyewitness to history, the March on Washington with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1963. Now, do you know who started Black History Month in America? Well, it was Dr. Carter G. Woodson. And who was Dr. Carter G. Woodson? Do you know the answer to that question? He was the second Black American to graduate with a doctorate degree from Harvard University, and he was a historian. Why was the month of February chosen? Do you know the answer to that question? Dr. Carter chose February in honor of Abraham Lincoln's birthday and the birthday of abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Now, when did Black History Month begin? It began as Negro History Week in 1926. 50 years later, President Gerald Ford in 1976 proclaimed it as Black History Month. And each year, there's a specific theme. And the theme for 2021 is Black Family, Representation, Identity, and Diversity. So we're going to talk about celebrating Black History Month for the month of February. But please remember, it's not just confined to February. You can celebrate Black History Month all year long. And today we're going to talk about some of the connections of Romulus, Michigan to Black history. So point number 1, Black history begins in Africa, not in American slavery. Although Black History Month began as an American celebration, the study of Black history begins at the beginning, in Africa, the motherland, the place where all civilization began. Before the captured Africans arrived in 1619 to be slaves, they were people, and they are people. They were people with a country, with a heritage, with a language, with a culture, with a civilization, and a history. So rather than referring to them as slaves, let's refer to them as enslaved persons, because they were people with a rich heritage before they were captured and brought to America. And my great-grandfather was one of those born in this country into slavery. And you'll see his picture later on in the presentation. Point number 2, African Americans had advanced civilizations. Do you think the ancient Africans in 1300 and 1200 and 1100 had schools? Do you think they had books? Do you think those ancient Africans had universities? Yes, they did. And that's the part of history, Black history, that is often neglected. And that's one reason why Dr. Carter Woodson said, let's devote a whole week, and Gerald Ford said, let's make it a whole month to try to fill in the gap of the history that had been neglected for so many years. So before there was American slavery, the ancient Africans had great civilizations. They had governments and kings and queens and schools and books and scientists and doctors and explorers. And you're looking at a picture of one of the universities in ancient Africa. And if you travel to Africa today, you can see that same university in Mali in Africa. This is a picture of some of the people who lived in ancient Africa. The Africans had books, and they told their stories in books, their history, but they also put their history on walls. They painted pictures on the walls. We call them murals today. And here you see the Black and brown people depicted on the walls of ancient Africa. Another picture of Sankore University in Mali, and they had a famous university in ancient Africa, just like we have the University of Michigan. The ancient Africans had the University of Timbuktu. Timbuktu was a famous university. People came from all over the then-known world to study with the African scholars, the African scientists, the African mathematicians. They came to the University of Timbuktu. And if you go to Africa today, you can see the University of Timbuktu still standing. The ancient Africans also were artists. They made beautiful cloth like this mud cloth. You're looking at the picture on the screen, but I brought a piece with me. They knew how to weave the cloth in strips and then sew it together and make beautiful designs using mud. This comes from the country of Mali, where the University of Timbuktu is located. Another kind of cloth is called kente, and you see the African weaving the kente strips. And here's a piece of kente, and the colors and the shapes tell a story. So you could tell which country someone came from by looking at the kind of cloth they were wearing. That would identify their country of origin. So those ancient Africans were architects also. They had two-story houses, and here are some of the columns showing the ingenuity of the African engineers and builders and architects. Did the ancient Africans have books? Did they write down stories and their history? Yes, they did. There are over 100,000 manuscripts, and some of them are still available in Africa, that those ancient Africans wrote about astronomy, music, botany, and mathematics. Africa is the second largest continent in the whole world, and it is rich with natural resources. Africa has lots and lots of gold and lots of ivory and grains, and the people had so much knowledge. Here are the Black pharaohs, and in the 1300s, one of the famous and one of the wealthiest rulers ever on this earth was the ruler named Mansa Musa. And you can read more about him from this book. And later on, we're going to tell you how you can get some of these books from an online Black-owned book company that's headquartered right here in Romulus, Michigan. So Mansa Musa, remember his name, he was a wealthy ruler in the 1300s in Mali. Here is a picture of some of the books from ancient Africa. The Africans had books and schools and universities. And one of the books that you can read today to learn more, boys and girls and listeners, is Moja Means One. It's a children's book, a Swahili counting book, and the companion to that is Jambo Means Hello, which is a Swahili alphabet book that won the Caldecott Award. Beautifully illustrated books that give you an idea of what life was like in ancient Africa. If you want to learn more, after reading some books, one of the world's famous African American museums is right here in Detroit. The Charles Wright African American Museum is in downtown Detroit. Have you been there? If not, visit their website, and when the pandemic's over, you can take an actual visit and learn so much more about life in ancient Africa and the Underground Railroad and what Black history spanning the centuries, the Charles Wright Museum. But if you want to travel, you can go to Washington, D.C. to the newest National African American Museum of History and Culture, a brand new museum. Makes a wonderful field trip and learns so much more about Black history. Well, after those ancient Africans enjoyed their great civilizations, their schools, their universities, their architects, their mathematicians, their scientists, something terrible happened. Explorers came from Europe and saw those riches, the gold, the universities, the people, and they wanted it for themselves. So they took it, and they put the people on ships and brought them across the Atlantic Ocean, dropped off some of the Africans in South America. In fact, the most of the Africans were sent to South America. The second stop was the Caribbean, or West Indies, and finally to our country, to America. And they forced those Africans to be slaves. They wanted them to forget their history, forget their beautiful textiles and that they were kings and queens in Africa, forget about their music and their African drums. In fact, when they were enslaved, they didn't even allow them to sing their African songs or to play their African instruments. No singing. They wanted them to forget their history. They would not allow them to speak their African languages. And they wouldn't even allow mothers and fathers who came on the boat to stay together in America. And if you were born in America like my great-grandfather was, they often separated families. They wouldn't let the families stay together because they didn't want them to talk about Africa, the great civilizations and their history. And that's another reason why Carter Woodson said, we need Black History Month. We need to learn these neglected parts of our history. So that passage across the Atlantic Ocean is referred to as the Middle Passage, and it's a triangular shape. From Africa to North and South America is one leg. Then the Africans were forced to work on the farms to grow the sugar cane, the tobacco, and the cotton. And then they harvested those products and then took them back to Europe for the Europeans to enjoy and to make them rich. Then the Europeans came back to Africa and took some more of the riches, and it's the shape of a triangle. It's also called the triangular slave trade. Now, some of the Africans who were brought over here became free, not a lot in the 1700s and 1600s, but a few of them did become free before the Emancipation Proclamation, and one of them was Benjamin Banneker. Have you heard of him? Benjamin Banneker was born free. His grandfather was an African who was brought here to be enslaved. And Benjamin Banneker became a famous inventor. If you don't know about him, please pick up a book. and learn about him. And he wrote a famous letter to Thomas Jefferson around 1776. Learn about Benjamin Banneker. And here are two books that I recommend. And if you see a star next to a book, that means it's one of my personal favorites, the books that I really love. So here are two books about Benjamin Banneker. Now, I told you that my great-grandfather was born into slavery. So here's me, here's my mother, here's my grandfather, and my great-grandfather was born into slavery. So I am just 2 generations away from an enslaved person. And on the screen, you see a picture of my great-grandfather. He was freed in 1863, and then he married, and that's my great-grandmother. Point number 3 in our presentation today is the Underground Railroad came through Romulus, Michigan. I think you already knew that, didn't you? Let's learn a little bit more about the Underground Railroad. You've heard of Frederick Douglass, and here's a book for adults to read to learn more about him. The Africans were not allowed to read. They didn't want them to learn, and of course they didn't want them to remember their history in Africa. And it was against the law for anyone to teach an African his ABCs. But Frederick Douglass found a secret way to learn how to read. You can find out how he did that. And so after he became free on the Underground Railroad, he wrote a book, and here it is. And you can read that book. This is for the adults. Now, here's one for the children. I told you that many of the parents were not allowed to stay with their children. Frederick Douglass was taken away from his mother. He only got to see her, I think, 2 times. And this book talks about one of those visits when his mother walked 12 miles just to spend a little time with her little son, Frederick. And the book is called Love 12 Miles Long. Although they were separated, the love was still strong, of course, between the family members. Here's a book that you've probably already read, Sweet Clara and the Freedom Quilt. The Underground Railroad was a secret way of traveling from slavery to freedom. And Michigan was one of the free states. Alabama and Maryland were some of the slave states. So, because the Africans weren't allowed to read or write, they couldn't write down the directions on how to get from Alabama to Michigan, so they had to find ingenious and creative ways to send messages. They used to send messages on the talking drum, but they weren't allowed to play the drum anymore. So they came up with some other ways, and one of the ways was to put the messages, the codes, on the quilts. And this book, Sweet Clara and the Freedom Quilt, which is one of my other favorites, talks about that. Now, there were lots of secret hiding places. There were lots of kind white people who helped the runaway enslaved persons, and there were lots of brave black free people who also helped on the Underground Railroad. And here's a picture of one of those secret tunnels. This tunnel is in Pennsylvania. But if you don't want to go to Pennsylvania to see a secret hiding place on the Underground Railroad, you can go to Detroit. There's a church in Detroit called Second Baptist Church, and they have a secret hiding place, a room almost as big as maybe your bedroom, or half the size of maybe your bedroom at home. And you can go there. They give tours, and you can go down into that room and sit. And that's where the enslaved persons used to wait until they could cross the Detroit River, because they were headed to Canaan land. Freedom land was Canada, and the code name for Canada was Canaan land. So you can visit the Second Baptist Church in Detroit, and you can also visit Hart Plaza in Detroit and see a statue commemorating the Underground Railroad. But if you don't want to go to Detroit to see an Underground Railroad safe house, you don't even have to travel, because Romulus, Michigan has one. Have you been to the Kingsley House right across from the Romulus post office? It was a safe house, a place where the enslaved runaway persons hid until it was safe to travel from Romulus to the Detroit River in Detroit. That house, the Kingsley House, and if you haven't been there, you can take a tour and You can call Miss Pearl Varner. Her number is 734-697-9628. I spoke to her today, and she said probably in the spring or when the pandemic's over, they can begin giving tours again. But you can go inside that house, and there are 3 secret hiding places in the Kingsley House in Romulus. The house was built in 1839 by Mr. Samuel Kingsley, a businessman, and I'm told that he's buried right here in the cemetery in Romulus. And you can take a tour of the Underground Railroad house right here in Romulus, Michigan. Michigan was a famous stop. It was the last stop, Detroit, on the Underground Railroad. So there are lots of houses, safe houses, hiding places all around Michigan, especially in Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti and Wayne. So you can learn a lot about the Underground Railroad just by studying the safe houses in Romulus and Michigan. In Romulus, one of the farmers, I think his name was Mr. Gardner, and there were others, he constructed a special wagon. The wagon had a secret compartment at the bottom. Do you see the picture on the screen? And he would hide the runaways at the bottom of his wagon. And he traveled down Eureka Road all the way until it ends. Have you been down there? Maybe you'll go down there. If you take Eureka Road from Romulus Post Office and the Kingsley House, you can travel the same route that the runaways traveled, hiding in the bottom of this wagon until they got to Wyandotte and the Detroit River. Another famous Underground Railroad spot in Romulus, Michigan is the Wesleyan Church. Back in the day, they called it the White Church, I think because it was painted white, like it is in this picture. In 1955, when the church was celebrating their centennial, they decided to renovate. So they moved the church back a few feet. And what do you think they discovered? A tunnel, a hole, a cellar. So they stopped the bulldozers and they saw some things down in the secret hiding place, a cellar. And there were some boys playing there, and they told the boys to jump into the hole because there were some artifacts in the hole. And there was a toy, some wooden carved toys, I'm told, down in the hole. So those boys jumped down in the hole where the Africans had waited, the runaway enslaved persons had waited in Romulus, right here at 5 Points in Michigan. Have you been there, listeners? Another historic Underground Railroad site right here in Romulus. So those boys jumped down in the hole and gathered those hand-carved artifacts. I'm told that some of them were toys. And guess what? I had a chance to meet that boy. He's all grown up. He came back to visit Romulus, and I had a chance to interview him. And I asked him about those toys. What did you do with those toys? I said. And he said he took them home, and they played with them. And I don't think he knows where they are now. But this is an interesting part of Romulus Underground Railroad history. And they found a trap door inside the church in the vestibule, and I've been inside the church too. And perhaps you can go there, and maybe they'll show you that trap door where the enslaved runaways would go down under the trap door, and then the tunnel under the church into the cellar, and then there was a tunnel to the Kingsley House. The Kingsley House used to be near what they called the White Church because it's painted white. The Kingsley House used to be located near the church. So then they could hide in the Kingsley's house until someone could take them in the wagon down which road? Eureka Road, all the way to the river. So in the Romulus Museum, there's a diary. And the diary was written by a Romulus resident named Hiram Morris around the 1860s. And he wrote in this diary, and this is what he wrote: "A lady came to the church today to speak about slavery." He doesn't say who the lady was, but I'm just wondering if that could have been Sojourner Truth. Could it have been? I don't know. Well, in 1863, as I mentioned, my great-grandfather was set free by the Emancipation Proclamation signed by President Abraham Lincoln. If you add 1863 plus 100, what year do you get to? 1963, and that takes us to our last point. The March on Washington with Dr. Martin Luther King. Do you know anyone who marched with Dr. King in 1963? Well, now you do, because you know me. And in 1963, my parents sent me on the bus from New York City, where I lived, to Washington, D.C., to march with Dr. King. I was a teenager, a little older than the girl in the picture. And I had a chance to march with 250,000 other people on that hot August 28th day in Washington, D.C. That was an event that I'll never forget. I was so happy to be able to march peacefully with Dr. King like these people are doing. Martin Luther King said we can change some of the unfair laws, but we're not going to use guns and violence like the people did who charged the Capitol. Martin Luther King said, no, we're not going to be violent. He says we can protest without being violent. And so we carried signs and we marched with Dr. King that day. I was so happy to be at that march. As I said, there were over 250,000 people that day, and I was standing about right over here. I remember so well. There were so many people, and we were crowded so close together, and there was no violence. There were a lot of police outside in the city because they thought there would be violence from other people. But there was no violence. Martin Luther King said, let's be nonviolent. We can change the unfair laws without being violent. And you know, he gave his very famous speech that day, his I Have a Dream speech. And he talked about the day when his 4 little children would live in a nation where they would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their what? Their character. So you can read more about Dr. King, and we would like to give you a 20% discount if you choose to order some books from an online Black-owned book company called Brown Sugar and Spice Books that's headquartered right here in Romulus. And there's a discount code, ROMBH20. That stands for Romulus Black History 20. And that's our gift to you, Romulus residents, if you choose to learn more by purchasing a book. So point number 4, and the last part of our story for today, is my experience in 1963. I was that little girl who went to, well, I was a teenager, I went to the March on Washington like this girl did in this story. She went to another march with Dr. King. And I can remember so well, as I mentioned, where I was standing in that big crowd you're looking at on the screen. I heard so many speeches. There were speeches from Catholics and Jews and Christians, and there was so much music. We heard folk songs, and we heard freedom songs, and we sang the theme song of the Civil Rights Movement, which is, and you probably know this song, We Shall Overcome. The youngest speaker that day, do you know who that was? It was John Lewis. He was only 23 years old. We heard lots of speeches from lots of people. There were people there from all over, from California, from New York, from Michigan, from Alabama. There were doctors, there were teachers, there were students, there were engineers, there were actors. There were lots of people who had come to say, yes, Dr. King, we want freedom and justice for everybody. Who do you think was the last speaker that day? They saved Dr. King for last. And he was young, too. He was just in his 30s. Dr. King gave his famous speech. Dr. King dreamed of a day when his little children would be treated just like the other children whose skin was not brown. You see, during that time, in the 60s and the 50s and the 40s and the 1930s, there were signs that separated people just because of the color of their skin. There were signs that said, if your skin is brown, You can't swing on these swings. You can't play at this playground. There were signs that said, if your skin is brown, you can't stay in this hotel. And that happened to our family. We couldn't stay in the hotel. There were signs that said, if your skin is brown, you can't even use the bathroom at the Howard Johnson's rest stop when you're traveling on the New Jersey Turnpike. And that happened to my family. We could buy the gas, but they wouldn't let us use the restroom. They had signs that said, if your skin is brown, you can't attend the new elementary school that we just built in the city. You have to go to the old school, and we're going to give you the old textbooks. And they were rules that said, if your skin is brown, you can't ride the school bus. The brown children had to walk. Do you think that was fair, listeners? Those were called the segregation signs. And Martin Luther King believed that we could change those signs so everyone can be treated with fairness and equality. And 250,000 other people came that day because they believed the same thing. And again, they didn't believe in using violence. No guns. Don't break the windows like they did at the Capitol not too long ago. Peaceful, nonviolent demonstrations. Some of the signs even talked about where you could drink water. They had signs separating people even at the water fountain. So Dr. King said, this is not right. What do you say? Do you think it's right? He said it's not right. So he had a dream that one day those signs will be taken down. And you know now we live in a land where the signs are taken down. So his nonviolent protests did work, and it still works today. Now, I'd like to offer each school in Romulus a free copy of this book called I Have a Dream. And what I love about this book, besides the beautiful pictures of that day, there's a CD with Dr. King's speech on it. So I'd like to give that to each school if you will have the students to write a report about this presentation and just send us one report for each grade. Principals, if you send one report from each grade to the email addresses on the screen, info@brownssbooks.com, we'd like to send you a copy of this book so each student will have a chance to read that copy of the book if you don't already have it. But if you do have it now, you'll have 2 copies. We want to give it to you. So the youngest speaker at the March on Washington, do you remember his name? John Lewis. And how old was he? 23. Well, he didn't stop actively participating in justice movements. He didn't stop. In his 30s, he kept going. In his 40s, he kept going. In his 50s, he became a congressman from the state of Georgia, and he worked in the U.S. Congress. And he just died last year, Congressman John Lewis, and I had a chance to meet him. He wrote several books, and here's a picture with me and Congressman John Lewis. And you can read one of the stories that was printed about me and my eyewitness experiences with Martin Luther King. You can read that story. It's online in a magazine called Adventist Review. Go to their site, adventistreview.org, and type in my name, Jacqueline Galloway Blake, and you'll read more about some of the eyewitness experiences that I've had with Martin Luther King and with Black history. So stop and learn more. Here are some resources that can help you to stop and learn more about Black history. Of course, there's the Romulus Historical Museum right across from the post office in the Little Red Schoolhouse. And then there's a virtual Black Romulus Cultural Heritage Center on the internet. It has lots and lots of information online. You can also go to the Romulus City Hall website and click on the Parks and Attractions link, and you'll see more. You can go to the www.fivepointschurch.com. The church that we talked about that had the secret cellar, they have a website that tells you more. And of course, our brown sugar and spice books and educational services that we talked about at www.brownssbooks.com. So here are some resources to help you to learn more. Now let's end with a quiz. Quiz yourself. Question number 1. Who was the founder of Black History Month in America? You can write these down if you like. Question number 2. What year was it founded? Question number 3. Name a university in ancient Africa. Name a university in ancient Africa. Question number 4. Name a wealthy ruler of ancient Africa. A wealthy ruler, we mentioned his name, of ancient Africa. Question number 5. Name an African American inventor of the 1700s who wrote a famous letter to President Thomas Jefferson around 1776. Who was that African American inventor who was not born into slavery, although his grandfather was brought here to be a slave? Question number 6. Name a vehicle used to transport runaways in Romulus, Michigan. What vehicle was used? Question number 7. Name a safe house in Romulus, Michigan that has 3 secret hiding places. Question number 8. What road did the runaways typically travel from Romulus to Detroit? What's the name of that road? Question number 9. Name a church in Romulus that helped runaway enslaved persons. Name the church. And question number 10. Name a person who lives in Romulus today who attended the 1963 March on Washington with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So, viewers, thank you for listening to this presentation for Black History Month, but please don't limit your study of Black History Month just to February. Celebrate Black History Month all year long. Read more and learn more. And don't forget, we have that discount for you, 20% discount, if you choose to purchase some books from brownssbooks.com, ROMBH20. ROMBH20 is the code. Thank you so much for listening.